This is the story of the French Revolution, or as many will call it, the beginning or starting point of the modern age. Ancient, medieval, and modern, as names for periods of history, are of course merely convenient labels. In themselves, they have no fixed meaning or hard and fast limits. When we talk of the end of the Middle Ages or the beginning of modern times, we are thinking in purely Western terms. The Chinese have other ideas, and we are usually thinking of the great complex of changes which occurred around the 15th and 16th centuries AD. Among these changes, we think especially of the Renaissance or increased study of classical art and learning, and the Reformation, which split the Catholic Church and created Protestantism. We think too of the discovery of the New World and the sea routes from Europe to the Far East, of the invention or development of print and of weapons using gunpowder, of the great extension of trade and the rise of the wealthy merchant class. And we think of the enlarged, powerful states built by a few kings strong enough to clamp down on feudal independence. State which, in a few cases such as England and France, could already be described as national. These changes were so important that they soon became regarded as marking the end of one epoch. From then on, called the Middle Ages, and the beginning of the modern age. Most historians have found it convenient to use these terms ever since. But time has gone on, and in the past 200 years, the world has seen more changes, and much greater ones, than in the previous 2000. So, we should have a very good cause if we pleaded for a fresh definition of the modern age. We might argue that it should be taken as the beginning with the scientific movement of the 17th century, or with revolutionary democracy in the late 18th, or with steam power, railways and industrialization in the 19th, or with mass motoring, flight and world wars in the 20th. We could even say quite rightly that the placing of the first man on the moon in 1970 opened up such fresh vistas for mankind that it heralded the dawn of a new age, or modern times. All this means that where we believe the modern era to begin depends not only on the facts but on habit. It also implies that human history is a continuous process, chopped up into sections only for purposes of study. If we are doing this chopping up, we usually find that a single event is not a satisfactorily division in itself. We can see, however, that from time to time, a whole series of events or developments, brings about really profound changes. At such moments, we may feel that mankind or that humankind is moving into a new age, and that we can draw a useful history dividing line. In this sense, if we look not for the starting point of the modern age, but for one of the main starting points of what can reasonably be regarded as the modern age, we shall certainly find this in Great French Revolution. It is with an account of the French Revolution that this story accordingly opens. But the French Revolution did not, of course, come and heralded out in the blue. Many of its ideas were to be found in the works of writers early in the 18th century, and as a revolution proclaiming democratic principles, it was anticipated by the American Revolution in 1775 to 1783. the War of Independence successfully waged by Britain's all 13 colonies in Northern America against the government of George III. The French Revolution, in fact, was only one of a number of developments which made the succeeding period very different from the preceding one. Outwardly, it has probably altered men's lives less than that other so-called revolution of a more gradual and peaceful kind which began in Britain in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, which its growth of machinery, factories and towns. With its growth of machinery, factories and towns. But the system of government under which men live and their citizen rights, which is what the French Revolution was largely about, may be just as important as to human progress as an increased supply of material things, which was the achievement of the Industrial Revolution. At any rate, the two revolutions together helped to transform the largely agricultural Europe of the 18th century, dominated by the aristocracy, into the highly industrialized Europe of today, dominated by the common man or his declared representatives. Some of the importance of the French Revolution lies in the way its battles went echoing on in France throughout the 19th century. As late as 1905 and 1906, French politics was still being fought around issues such as the relations of the church and the state, which had divided Frenchmen as far back as 1790s. But much of its importance also lies in the revolution's impact in the rest of Europe and the world. In one way or another, but mostly by inspiring revolution or by direct conquest, the French revolutionaries and their heir, Napoleon Bonaparte, affected almost the whole of Europe. South America, too, became profoundly influenced, as did part of the West Indies. Almost everywhere the struggle continued long after the revolution itself, into the second half of the 19th century. On all sides, popular or liberal movements strove to overthrow aristocratic governments, and aristocratic governments strove to suppress popular or liberal movements. In much the same way, we witness today the effects of a later and still more radical revolution, the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks or communists in Russia in 1917. More than half of a century later, people are still fighting or struggling along the battle lines laid down by the Russian Revolution. Now, this chapter is all about Europe on the eve of the French Revolution. Chapter 1. Europe on the eve of the French Revolution was more varied than the one of nowadays, though it has no division as rigid as the Soviet present-day iron cutting. In general, Western Europe is very advanced compared with Eastern Europe. The two states at their eastern extremities, the Russian and the Ottoman empires, were undoubtedly the most backward of all. Now this is about West and East. Now we come to Sweden. In the north of the most important power was Sweden. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Sweden had made many conquests. By the 1780s, it had largely exhausted herself and given up her continental ambitions. She still, however, held Finland and some territory in Germany. Her monarchy was fairly strong, having recently managed to bring the Swedish parliament and nobility under control. Her peasants were free, unlike those in Eastern Europe, who were mostly serfs bound to the land on which they worked. Now, we come to Denmark and Norway. The second strongest country in the north was Denmark, which controlled Norway and had a large navy. Her monarchy was still autocratic and many of her peasants were still serfs, though those of Norway were not. The Scandinavian lands as a whole played an important trading role in Europe, especially in the supply of naval stores, furs, fish, grain and mineral. Trade apart, their influence beyond the Baltic was now small. We come to the Russian Empire. In the east lay the vast and developed lands of the Russian Empire, then as now only part of Europe. It had steadily grown from the fortress and trading center of Moscow. In the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, the rulers of the rulers of Moscow, supported by the Orthodox Church to which the Russian peoples belonged, had freed themselves from the earlier Mongol invaders of Russia and taking over neighboring territories. By the 16th century, the Duke or Prince of Moscow had become king or Tsar, as Slavonic from Caesar, and his realm stretched from the Arctic to the Caspian and across the Urals into Serbia. It was the task of the Tsar Peter the Great in the early 18th century to give his kingdom a westward thrust by winning an outlet to the Baltic and by establishing at the head of the Gulf of Finland a new capital, that is St. Petersburg. Peter, who took the head of the Gulf, Finland, additional title of emperor, also gave Russian institutions, including the nobility, a dose of compulsory Westernization. His main object seems to have been to make Russia's government, industry, and armed forces strong enough to hold their own against the West. Of course, he could barely scratch the surface of his huge country, but Peter nevertheless succeeded in making it one of the great European powers. Now, here we are talking about Peter the Great, who existed from 1696 to 1725, and his Westernization. Now here we look at Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, and the Enlightenment. Okay. Russia's ruler when the French Revolution broke out was the Empress Catherine II the Great. Like Peter, she believed in modernization. A German by birth, she was a true product of Enlightenment, the movement of the 18th century Europe, which criticized superstition and the blind forces of tradition and pleaded instead for reforms inspired by human reason. But although Catherine made improvements in Russian law and institutions and encouraged knowledge of Western culture, Russia remained a completely autocracy. The Tsar's power was absolute. In at least one respect, Catherine set her country back. To keep the nobles loyal to the throne, she gave them large grants of crown lands and estates in her newly acquired territories. The result was to extend serfdom to many areas where it was previously unknown. Whatever her limitations as a reformer, Catherine was certainly a worthy successor to Peter the Great. As an emperor builder, Catherine extended Russia southwards to the Black Sea and into the Crimea by warring against the remaining Tatar tribesmen and their supporters, the Ottoman Turks. By joint action with Prussia and Austria, she dismembered a large part of Portland and came off with the lion's share of the spoils. The Ottoman Empire. Russia's neighbor to the south was the great Muslim power, the Ottoman or the Turkish Empire, whose sultan reigned at Constantinople. This empire had reached its zenith in the 17th century when for the second time the Turkish force threatened Vienna. The flood of Turk success had been stemmed and Hungary freed. But the Turks still held power over the Christian peoples of Southeast Europe. The Serbs, Wallachians, Bulgars, Greeks and others. Because of this difference in the religion between governors and the governed, the Turks never formed a real state out of all this territory. They were there merely as occupiers. Their rule was generally light, except when taxes were unpaid or resistance offered. Massacres and atrocities then quickly came the order of the day. In addition to the Balkan countries, the Ottoman Empire, including most of Asia Minor, the Levant and North Africa, all the local rulers, whether Muslims in Algiers, Egypt, and Syria, or Greeks, as was often the case in the European provinces, enjoyed a good deal of independence. In fact, by the late 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was ripe for breaking up. At all times, Russia and Austria were ready to speed up the breaking. Now, the Hapsburg territories. In Southeast Europe, the Ottoman Empire's northern neighbor was the Kingdom of Hungary. This had come under the rule of the House of Hapsburg, whose power stretched out from the capital Vienna in the ancestral Duchy of Austria. There was no one name given to all the Hapsburg possessions, which besides Austria and Hungary included Bohemia and Moravia, now part of Czechoslovakia, Galicia, now part of Poland, the Hungarian dependency of Croatia, now part of Yugoslavia, territory in northern Italy, and the southern part of Austria, or the Austrian Netherlands, now Belgium. Over all these lands stood the head of the House of Hapsburg, who was also by custom elected by the Emperor of what was officially called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The Holy Roman Empire by the 18th century, more usually known as the Empire, was a loose grouping of more than 300 states covering modern-day Germany and some areas grouping beyond. Both as the emperor and as the ruler of Austria and other Germanic lands, the head of the Habsburgs, had a big stake in what was called Germany. But most of his territory was not German at all. Inhabitants by many different nationalities, the Habsburg realm became known as the Austrian Empire in 1804 and as Austrian-Hungary in 1867. Outside Italy, in the Netherlands, they were largely agricultural, and in Central Europe, German usually ran the biggest towns. Joseph II, like Catherine II of Prussia, He was a disciple of the Enlightenment and aimed to rule as an enlightened despot. Some of his reforms were admirable, such as the great religious toleration and the ending of the serfdom and his hereditary lands. But his relentless energy, his determination to enforce economies and increase state revenue, his interference with local customs and his attempts to secure uniformity, for example, by making the German language compulsory for official purposes, gradually created overwhelming opposition. Finally, he had to withdraw most of his reforms, and he died in 1790, bitterly conscious of his failures. Now, the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, of which the ruler of Austria was traditionally elected head, was described by Voltaire during the 18th century as neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The emperor, in fact, was largely a figurehead, and though there was a diet or assembly of rulers of the different states, it had very limited authority. Nearly all the real power rested with the state rulers themselves. Only the greatest of these states, however, the nine whose rulers elected the emperor, counted for much of European politics. Among these nine, Bavaria, Saxony, and Hanover, whose elector was also King of Great Britain and Ireland, were all important, but the outstanding state apart from the territories directly under the emperor himself was the Kingdom of Prussia. Its creators, the Hohenzollern electors of Brandenburg, had begun by building up a strong army and military tradition. Their successor Frederick the Great, an enlightened despot who died just before the French Revolution, used these assets to extend the Prussian kingdom still further, mainly at the expense of Austria and Poland. Poland. To her great misfortune, Poland by the mid-18th century had three very powerful neighbors: Prussia, Austria, and Russia. At the beginning of the century, she had been a large kingdom extending far beyond strictly Polish areas. Her peculiar institutions, however, made it hard for her to remain a great power. Institutions such as peculiar institutions. Now, such as an elective monarchy which encouraged outside powers to back rival candidates, and in liberum veto or free veto, by which any member of the Polish Diet could block a proposed measure by his single vote. This privilege made it easy for foreign powers, by bribing a few individuals, to paralyze Polish action whenever they chose. Notorious for the archaic behavior of the nobles who dominated the country and who until 1778 had the power of life and death over the serfs, Poland became less and less able to withstand her three big brothers. In 1772, on Prussia's suggestion, the three surrounding powers settled their own differences by agreeing to rob Poland, whom they stripped of a third of her territory and half of her population. Within a little more than 20 years, they were to gobble up all the rest. Italy. No single authority as yet ruled the whole of Italy. The Italian peninsula, though sharing a common language and literature, was still a conglomerate of kingdoms, duchies and republics. It had long suffered from internal warfare, often brought about by outside rulers eager to acquire Italian territory. By the late 18th century, The most important states in the south was the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, the two Sicilies, ruled by a member of the Spanish branch of the Bourbon family. Naples was a great city, but most of Sicily was desperately poor. In the center of the peninsula lay the state of the church under the sovereignty of the Pope. They contained only two big cities, Rome and Bologna, and were noted mainly for poverty, backwardness, and malaria. In the north of Italy, the rising power of Piedmont, with the fast-growing city of Turin as its capital. It was ruled by the House of Savoy, whose territory also included the island of Sardinia, which gave its name to this whole northern kingdom. Among other important states were the duchies of Modena, Parma, and Tuscany in the central Italy, and in the great trading republic of Vienna in the northeast. The rulers of all these states, though sometimes of foreign origin, Tuscany, for instance, was ruled by the younger brother of the Hapsburg emperor, at least lived in the state concerned. Most of Lombardy, including its great city Milan, however, came directly under an outside power. It had become a Habsburg possession early in the 18th century and was ruled and usually ruled well by local Italians under an Austrian viceroy. Socially, Italy was almost as diverse as she was political. Cities of great prosperity and artistic magnificence existed side by side with areas of appalling poverty. Italy was only a geographical expression, incapable of united action. Spain, on the contrary, was a great power, though not as dominant as she had been earlier. Her decline, which had set in under her later Habsburg monarchs during the 17th century, had been halted under her new Bourbon kings in the 18th, and she was still the ruler of the great empire. Early in the scene, in Atlantic exploration, she held vast tracts of Central America from California and Texas downwards, most of South America except Brazil, and several of the West Indian islands, besides other outposts in the Philippines. Spain had been strong in her religious and to some extent her national unity, though the latter was marred by resentment of Catalonians and Aragonese and Basques against the supremacy of Castile. The foundation of Spain's wealth had been gold and silver from the New World. But this had also brought problems. Such cheaply acquired riches, which could easily buy goods in the world markets, discouraged manufacturers and even enterprising agriculture at home. Spain, thus, from the church's stronghold on independence thinking, exerted through the Inquisition. In foreign policy, the Spanish kings preserved a steady alliance with their fellow Bourbons in France, and this helped Spain to stand up to British enmity. Britain was determined to break down Spain's monopoly of trade with the Spanish colonies, and she had already particularly succeeded. Several times in the 18th century, the British and the Spanish fought each other. During the Seven-Year War in 1756 and 1763, victory had gone to Britain, but the most recent bout of fighting, when the Spanish helped Americans during the War of Independence, had ended in favor of Spain. Spain's neighbor, Portugal, had survived a period of a Spanish annexation and regained her independence in 1640. She had still owned a large colonial empire, including Brazil, but had lost most of her eastern possessions to the more enterprising Dutch. As with Spain, her imports of gold discouraged industrial development, and despite efforts at modernization during the 1750s and 1770s, she remained one of the poorest and most backward countries of Europe. This did not stop her spending enormous sums on the construction of churches. She retained much of her empire, largely because of the naval strength of Britain, with whom she maintained a costly alliance. This alliance was based on commerce as well as politics. By the constant alliance, Methuen Treaties of 1703, Portuguese wines were imported by Britain at much lower customs rate than French wines. In return for similar concessions to the English woolen exports to Portugal. Our ancestors' heavy consumption of port wine and the tendency to gout among the upper class was one result of this agreement. Adjoining France to the northeast were the Netherlands, which since the 17th century had been sharply divided. The southern Netherlands, with Brussels as its capital and Antwerp, and the Charente as its great inland port, had remained under Spanish and hence Catholic domination during the 17th century and had come under the Austrian Hapsburgs in the early years of the 18th. Austria rule was light, and during the 18th century the Austrian Netherlands increased rapidly in population and developed a prosperous agriculture. Commercial growth was difficult, however, because the Dutch, who controlled the mouth of the Strait, refused to admit international trade up the river of Antwerp. They were entitled to do this by long-standing treaties secured after their successful war against Spain and France. The United Provinces, that is the Holland, north of Austrian Netherlands, was the territory of the Dutch, the state which since 1579 had called itself the United Provinces of the Netherlands. These were the 7 mainly Protestant provinces which had successfully kept up the revolt against the Philip II of Spain and had their independence finally recognized in 1748. In alliance with England, the Dutch had since then fought off the attacks of Louis XVI France and had grown extremely rich. Though they were great improvers in agriculture, commerce was their life's blood. And to protect it and their independence, they had built up powerful naval forces. This in turn enabled them to maintain a great colonial empire, one mainly in the far east and the expense of Portugal. Decline of Dutch power. More recently, however, during the American War of Independence, the Dutch and the British had been in conflict with the Dutch ending up as the losers. By the 1780s, it was becoming clear that the strain of repeated wars and internal strife was sapping the province's strength. The internal quarrels arose partly from the desire of the greatest province, Holland, and its chief town, Amsterdam, to dominate the rest, and partly from the system of government. The United Provinces were, apart from Switzerland, an only republic of much size in Europe. Their supreme authority was their State General of Parliament. Each province also had its own parliament and begrudged surrendering power to the central authority. In times of crisis, however, exceptional power was given in each province to an official known as stadtholder. And by the mid-18th century, the House of Orange had managed to secure his office and his commandership of the forces on the hereditary basis in all the provinces. This pull towards monarchy was strongly resisted by the ardent Republicans, but finally succeeded when the Kingdom of the Netherlands was established in 1815 after the defeat of Napoleon. Spain, Savoy, and Piedmont, the Empire, and the Austrian Netherlands were not France's only neighbors. There was also the Swiss Confederation, which had won independence from the Hapsburgs in the 15th century and an acknowledgement of this in the 17th. Though little more than a permanent alliance of tiny states, it held together by compromise and a fairly tolerant outlook, for some of the cantons were Protestants and other Catholics. Between them, they spoke three main languages as well as local dialects. Protected by its mountains, Switzerland had a number of profitable activities, including agriculture, banking, textile manufacture, mining, and the making of clocks, watches, and toys. A republic without a nobility and with a prosperous citizenry, it was more democratic than the rest. The causes of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was not the event of a single month or year. In its most novel, violent, or revolutionary aspects, it lasted from 1789 to the rise of Napoleon. But just as its effects carried forward into the 19th and 20th century, so its origins stretched back into the 17th and 18th century. The prime cause was the existing system of government, the practices of what was afterwards called ancient regime. The old regime, that is. Indeed, these practices can hardly be called a system, for in general, they came nearer to chaos, So, chaotic were the legal arrangements that in 1789 there still existed 360 different feudal codes of law in different parts of France. In one town alone, there were 29 feudal courts. In taxation, the chaos was such that when a geographer in 1789 tried to draw a map showing the customs dues of the various districts, he had to give it up as too complicated to attempt. A boat bearing wine from the south of France to Paris, for example, paid over 40 tolls and lost a fortnight in the process. In other fields of administration, matters were no better. The government tried to regulate affairs in over 40,000 townships and struggled hopelessly against overwhelming affairs in over 40,000 townships and areas of business. One parish, for instance, which petitioned for a government loan to repair its leaking church roof, waited over 10 years for an answer. In spite of all this utter inefficiency, two principles stood out. Nearly all power in national matters was in the hands of the king and his personal advisors, and in the main, burdens of taxation were borne by the classes less able to support them. In the magnificent palace of Versailles, remote from contact with any but the nobility, the upper clergy and his officials, that is, Louis XVI, strove to control the destinies of France. There were several royal councils, a royal controller of finances, royal deputies in the provinces known as intendants, a royal controller of finances, and royal officials everywhere through whom the king governed. But the system restricted primarily on Louis himself, for his word was virtually law. The states, Louis had said, with vanity but with accuracy, is, I myself, Louis XIII, was later on to remark, concerning a dispute issue, the thing is legal because I wish it. Such a statement sums up the whole nature of the government of the ancient regime. The mass of the people had no share in government, and even the rising middle class had very little. For though there remained some of the old medieval institutions in which the wealthier burgesses played a part, these had either lost the habit of opposing the king or else had themselves become largely aristocratic. Institutions which had lost the habit of opposing included many of the assemblies known as tsars or states or estates, which still met in some of the provinces and which was supposed to represent the loyal community in its three estates or orders of clergy. First state, that is the nobility; second estate and others, that state; and as for the estates or generals or states general, the assembly of the three estates which was supposed to represent the whole realm. This existed only as memory. It had last been called in 1614. The Parliament of Paris. There were, however, still 12 provinces, that is the parliaments, or legal corporations, which acted as courts of justice and could theoretically disregard the royal wishes in reaching their decisions. Above all, there was the Parliament of Paris, which also had the task of registering the king's edicts as laws and claimed that its consent was necessary before this could properly be done. In point of fact, however, those members of the Paris Parliament who were not nobles of the order sort, that is the nobility of the sword, had become nobles of a newer and lesser kind, appropriate to magistrates and officials, the nobility of the robe. They were a privileged group, normally content to go along with the king while he respected their privileges. When he did not, as in the year 1787 to 1788, their opposition began the sequence of events which led to the revolution. Now, these are the lettres de cachet. In sum, during the 17th and 18th centuries, the will of the sovereign had become virtually the law, so much so that any critic of the government or opponent of some favored noble was liable to be arrested quite arbitrarily on the issue of royal right, known as the lettre de cachet or sealed letter. He could then find himself flung into prison without a trial or even an accusation of having committed any particular crime. Some 150,000 of these wreaths were issued in the reign of Louis and another 14,000 under Louis. By no means all of these concerned cases which actually affected the government. Many were issued on the request of the cases which actually affected the government. As allies and buttresses in this system of royal power, the crown had the clergy numbered some 300,000 out of a population of around 25 million. Yet, the ancient regime in France worked almost wholly to their profit. They owned about 3/5 of the land. Many of the nobility were gathered around Louis at Versailles in useless attendance and did not work. The high clergy drew pricely rents and shared the general characteristic of the nobility. The lower clergy, however, such as the parish priests, were poorly paid and had plenty to do. Often they received less than 100 of a bishop's income, and their sympathies consequently lay not with the superiors but with the third estate. Extraordinary privileges were possessed by the nobility and clergy. the most outstanding being exemption from the main way of taxation. The nobles were relieved of many taxes and paid others lightly. The clergy made only a free gift. The unprivileged position of a peasant. The financial burden of the peasant, or the other hand, was crushing. Not only did he pay several taxes to the king, notably the 20th vintim of his income, which most nobles paid a land tax, that is the taille, and a poll tax, that is the capitation. But in addition, he paid a tithe of the produce of his land to the church, a gabel or salt tax, and everyone over 7 years of age had to buy 7 lb of salt a year. A customs duty if he took his goods through a village, and a money due to the lord, who his grapes went to the Lord's wine press, or his corn to the Lord's mill, and usually they had to go. By a system of game laws, he had to be powerless witness of the game, or its hunters destroying his crops. He alone of all classes were not exempt from militia service. As if these burdens were insufficient, he was often liable to be forced labor on the lands of the public buildings. It is little wonder that the peasantry taxed more and more heavily as the expenses of the French government mounted in the 18th century, and in many cases, seeing their superiors living in great luxury, were becoming ripe for revolt. Some 10,000 of them were annually imprisoned, 2,000 condemned to the galleys, and several hundred executed for offenses against the salt laws alone. Yes, it is not so much from the peasantry as from the more prosperous members of that estate, the educated section of lawyers and doctors especially, that the drive towards revolt came. Though not suffering the economic burden of the peasant, these men resented their exclusion from official positions to the head of the army, the navy, and the diplomatic service. They resented not being able to criticize openly a ridiculous system of government. They resented the lack of religious freedom. If a Protestant service was discovered, I will repeat that. If a Protestant service was discovered, the pastor might be hanged and the congregation all sent to the galleys. They resented the liability of the third estate to suffer torture, breaking on the wheel, and forms of mutilation which was spared nobles and the clergy. Above all, they felt themselves unfairly excluded from all the share in government. What is the third estate? Wrote one of the leaders in 1789. Everything. What has it been hitherto in our form of government? Nothing. What does it want? To become something. It is not surprising that almost all the revolutionary leaders came from this class. The influence of the philosophers. There was a further reason apart from their actual grievances to account for the leadership of the reform movement by the bourgeois. It was, of course, they rather than the peasants or the urban poor who enjoyed the possessions and self-confidence necessary to direct a revolution, but above all, it was they who had the political education. This they had found in the work of certain French writers or philosophers of the 18th century. In the first place, there was Francois Marie Aroucout, who later called himself Voltaire, famous all over Europe as a historian, a popularizer of science, a tragic dramatist, and a poet. He was also an unsarcastic critic of existing institutions, and especially in the church. He himself had known the inside of Bastille, the great prison of Paris, and what a letter Descartes could mean. Over certain flagrant miscarriages of justice, he fought for years to secure the reversal of the verdict and the rehabilitation of the honor of the wronged man. He became at once the most admired and the most feared man in Europe, while the very class he criticized, that is the nobility and royalty, competed for the honor of entertaining him. Only his great enemy, the church, could never forgive him for his criticism and his deism. The friend of the two most unscrupulous monarchs of the 18th century, Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine of Russia, he was equally willing to hold up a monarch to administration for enlightened intentions and to ridicule for unenlightened achievements. With 4 estates on the borders of France and Switzerland, he could speed from one to the other when officials were in his track. Only at the end of his life could he come safely to Paris to see his last play produced, and then the populace thronged to welcome the man who had fought injustice so bravely. But Voltaire knew humanity. He said, "There come in just the same crowd to see me executed." Yet with all his devastating satire and his wit, and for all his campaigns against religious persecution, acquitted and unfair taxation and torture, he had nothing positive to suggest to replace the monarchy. He was no Democrat. "I had rather," he remarked, "be ruled by one lion than by 100 of rats." His contribution, great thought, was negative, not positive. Together with Voltaire may be mentioned the work of the encyclopedists by Denis Diderot. They set out to compile an encyclopedia which will be an account to all existing knowledge. As it went, its articles on political and religious subjects gave increased offense to the authorities. Indeed, no faithful account of contemporary knowledge could be given which did not demonstrate the folly and injustice in many existing claims and practices in church and state. Among the earlier contributions were some of a group often known as the economists. They advocated the abolition of all taxation except that all land which will be paid mainly by the clergy and nobility, but for a general theme of government, they mainly they too had no other solutions than enlightened despotism. A more positive contribution was made by the Baron de Montesquieu, who saw the importance of geographical conditions. After experimentally freezing a tongue and observing that the taste papillae was smaller and less sensitive in the cold than in the heat, he concluded that people in hot climates would feel things more passionately than those in cold or temperate regions, and will be less able to keep themselves under control. So a strict despotism, he thought, would be best suited for them, while Northern Europe might be trusted with an element of democracy. Visiting England, he found the modest he sought. In his chief book, De Esprit des Lois, which ran through 22 editions in 18 months, he held up the English Constitution, with its parliament, its independent judges, and its constitutional king as worthy of imitation by France. He was especially keen on the idea of the various parts of the government acting as checks on each other, thus helping to preserve the liberty of the individual. His influence both in the French and American Revolution leaders was profound. But the philosopher, who more than all the others provided a positive creed, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His stormy life, in the course of which he was driven out both from native city of Geneva and from his adopted France, typified the spirit of revolution. A poet and a musician who had written a successful opera, he turned to politics and preached the equality of men. In his greatest political work, that is the Do Contract Social, he seeks a justification for the fact that man, though born free, is everywhere in chains, i.e., is everywhere subject to government. This justification he can find only if the ideas and desires of the people are really carried out by the government, or, as he puts it, if the general will is sovereign. Only in this way is liberty retained and equality realized. Obviously, however, the general will is much less likely to be carried out in a monarchy than in democracy. In fact, he wanted a direct democracy where all men actually decided issues, not a representative democracy like that of Britain where other people are elected to decide them. The English people, he wrote, is free only during the election of its MPs. As soon as they are elected, it is a slave, it is nothing. He suggested dividing a large state into a number of small direct democracies and the binding of these into a federation. But it was the spirit of democracy rather than the details which affected the revolutionary leaders. Catching from Racine also a strong vein of emotion and love of nature, the revolutionary leader developed the passion and violence needed for revolution. Racine thus not only supplied the main doctrine, the sovereignty to the people, and supremacy of the general will, but also helped to create the emotional spirit which made people ready to rebel. Example of the American Revolution. The philosophers then supplied much of the theory which underlay the revolution, even though all the ones mentioned above were dead before the revolution broke out. It was America, however, which supplied the main practical example. In 1776, the old 13 British colonies, already in a revolt, issued their Declaration of Independence. And by 1783, they had secured their freedom as the United States of America. From 1778, France, anxious to obtain revenge for the loss of her colonies in Canada and India during the 7 Years' War, that in 1756 to 1763, willingly helped the Americans against Britain and enjoyed her most successful war of the century. So little, though, of the consequences. French soldiers who had served in America poured back to France full of American democratic ideas. They helped to free a nation whose only real grievance was not that of British taxing them, but that they might tax them. An extra tea duty of 3p, the sole tax still payable by Americans to Britain in 1776, broke up the British Empire. When the French compared this with the overwhelming burdens of their own peasantry, it rapidly became apparent that if the Americans were justified to revolt, and the French were far more justified in revolting against the French. The Americans rebelled not so against misgovernment as for the sake of self-government. The French, with the additional spur of misgovernment, were not slow to learn the lesson. It was no accident that one of the earliest leaders of the French Revolution was the Marquis de Tafia, returned 6 years before from the War of Independence. But the influence of the American Revolution did not end there. Perhaps even more important, the cause of the war to France meant the last straw of the already cracking back of her finances. All the century, the situation had been getting worse. The enormous luxury of the French court under Louis too, although he was by comparison very economical, and had only 2,000 horses and 200 carriages in his royal stable, while his Queen Marie managed with only 500 servants and 4 pairs of shoes a week. The ridiculous, inefficient system of taxation by which the nobles and clergy escaped extremely lightly, while the peasantry, owning about a third of the land, paid practically everything and nothing to commend it. By 1785, even the nobles and clergy were beginning to see that the situation was impossible. Further, the cost of the tax collection, sometimes done by selling the right of collection of the higher bidder, who made what he could swallowed an absurd proportion of the taxes. The salt tax, for example, brought in 60 million livres, but cost 20 million to collect. And about 50,000 troops and agents had to be used to suppress smuggling. Above all, the constant wars for over a century and the ruinous loss of most of the French Empire in the 7 Years' War had made continuous borrowing necessary and had piled up the enormous amount of debt. Each year, about one half of the royal income had to be set aside to pay interest on debts. And even then, the monarchy had already defaulted 5 times in the 18th century by reducing interest or repudiating debt. When on top of the chaotic and dangerous situation, the government of Louis joined in the War of American Independence and spent 2,000 million livres in helping to bring about the defeat of Britain, it also brought about its own bankruptcy. The financial situation was now desperate. Already 2 controllers general with reforming ideas, first the great intendant and economist Turgot, then the Geneva financier Jacques Necker, had attempted remedies which might have staved off disaster, only to come up against the rock-like obstacle of all established privileges. Now a new Controller General and former Intendant Colony came to the same conclusion as Turgot and Necker, that nothing could be done to restore the national finances, while the nobles and clergy remained exempt from the bulk of taxation. To help break down this exemption, in particular by a new land tax falling in the landowners, Colony advised the king to call an assembly of notables, nobles, clergies, officials and others to the selected by the crown. The notables met in 1787, but not surprisingly failed to approve all Colony's desired reforms. Equal failure then followed the efforts of Colony's successor, Archbishop Brienne, both to have his own proposed measures registered by the Paris Parliament and then to suspend the parliaments altogether. At least, however, the cry of reform was now in the air, and in both the notables and in Paris Parliament, voices were raised to demand that, if great changes were contemplated, the proper body to give on them was long defunct State General. In desperation, Brienne clutched at his straw, hoping to destroy by this means the most flagrant exemptions of the privileged classes. He advised the king to call the State General. He had aroused such opposition that the king could no longer retain him. But this successor, the recalled Necker, confirmed Brienne's advice and suggested an early date for the meeting. So it was decided that the State General should meet again in May 1789, after a lapse of 175 years. Minister and monarchy little thought that their device for ending bankruptcy will begin to the revolution. It was natural, of course, though. It surprised the government that the calling of the State General and the official request for the list of grievances which preceded it should open the floodgates of criticism. But the outcome depended on how the demands of the Third Estate were to be handled by the king. And unfortunately for France, Louis was a king in name and in power, but not in character. Full of the best intentions, he had rapidly appointed as Controller General first one outstanding reformer, Turgot, then another, Necker. He could never be relied on to carry out these intentions consistently. He had dismissed Turgot and Necker with equal promptitude. At every stage in the revolution, he was to encourage reform and then to draw back. Such inconsistency was to bring its almost inevitable reward. It is not usually the strong, the brutal ruler of this earth who lose their thrones, but the inconsistent, well-intentioned ones. When you can keep together a number of oil ivory balls, one of his relatives said to Louis, "You may do something with the king." Mildly interested in reforms, more interested in his kingship, but most interested in hunting. Louis was to hesitate to play for time, to yield and to deny, till the forces which he had released caught him up in their torrential current and swept him and his monarchy to destruction. Louis was also unfortunate in his advisers. Necker lacked firmness, and the one great man who was later to try to save the king, Mirabeau, died at a critical moment. For the most part, in fact, Louis was under the fatal influence of his wife, that is, Marie Antoinette. Extremely unpopular among the French as the representative of the hated Austrian alliance, which had led to the disastrous 7-year war and the loss of colonies, she was nicknamed with contempt, that is, Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. Ignorant of the need for reform and sympathetic of her people's needs and incapable of grasping the political situation, she poisoned Louis' mind, first against Turgot and then against Necker, and everywhere advised a fatal firmness at precisely the wrong moments. The king, said Mirabeau, has only one man about him, his wife. France's destiny rested with a king who was too weak-minded to be stable and a queen who was too strong-minded to be sensible. Finally, among the many factors leading to the revolution must be mentioned the rise in price which had taken place during the 18th century and which had been accompanied by any corresponding increase in wages. All over Europe, thanks largely to improved medical knowledge, the population was increasing. Even if most of it lived in wretched conditions, and an increase come at a time demand for scarce goods and food, and so helped to cause higher prices. It has been calculated that between 1730 and 1789, grain prices in France rose by about 60%, whereas wages rose only by 22%. The result was widespread poverty at the lower end of society, sharpened by the countryside by the fact that landlords, to counteract the declining value of some of their fixed dues, began to exploit their privileges more vigorously than ever. To complete this deteriorating situation, the weather of 1788 was disastrous. It ruined the harvest, raised corn to a famine price, and caused widespread starvation. This calamity was to be followed by the desperately severe winter of early 1789, when all the great rivers of France were frozen and even the port of Marseille in the extreme south was blocked with ice. The result was an even greater distress than usual. A commercial treaty with Britain in 1786 admitting British manufactured goods at cheap rates in return for corresponding concessions on French wine had already caused much industrial suffering. In some towns, as many as half the workmen were unemployed. It had long been the custom in certain parts of France for the rural poor to seek work in towns during the winter. Now, hordes of people gathered in Paris, and the other great towns from the surrounding country, hoping to find food and shelter in urban conditions. So came into being the characteristic Paris mob of the Revolution, idle, desperate, ready to cheer on more extreme measures, and destined to sway the fortunes of events on more than one vital occasion. All the material for a great combustion was now present. An outworn, inefficient, unfair, and bankrupt system of government. A strong body of Reformation opinion created by the philosophers. The successful example of the Americans. A weak king and unpopular queen. Widespread economic distress. And a desperate mob of exceptional size in Paris. It needed only a spark to set it all alight, to turn the smoldering of 1787 to 1789 into a fire. On 5th May 1789, the State of General met.